Ryan, a gentle farmer, awoke at dawn, savoring the crisp morning air that embraced his peaceful farmland. The golden sunlight danced across the fields as birds chirped their melodious tunes. However, his tranquil morning ritual was abruptly shattered. There, blocking the entrance to his storage barn, sat a gleaming yellow SUV parked without permission on his property. "What the hell?" Ryan muttered, approaching the vehicle cautiously. The SUV, with its tinted windows and luxury emblem, looked completely out of place amidst the rustic surroundings. Ryan waited patiently, hour after hour, but no one returned to claim the vehicle. As the sun began to set, his patience finally broke. "They think I'll tolerate this nonsense. But they've chosen the wrong farmer to bully." Ryan Wilson had been a farmer for nearly 15 years, tending to his modest but productive farmland on the outskirts of Maplewood. His weathered hands and sun-kissed face told stories of countless harvests, early mornings, and late nights. The 20-acre property had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from his grandfather who had built it from nothing during the post-war era. Unlike the sprawling industrial farms that dominated the agricultural landscape nowadays, Ryan's operation remained refreshingly traditional. He grew organic vegetables, maintained a small apple orchard, and raised free-range chickens that produced eggs sought after by local restaurants and farmers markets. His reputation for quality produce had earned him respect throughout the community. At 42, Ryan lived alone in the farmhouse his grandfather had built. His wife, Sarah, had passed away 5 years earlier after a brief battle with cancer, leaving him to manage both his grief and the farm single-handedly. The solitude suited him now. He found peace in the rhythms of nature and the predictable cycles of planting and harvesting. "There's something honest about this work," he often told visitors. "The land doesn't lie to you. It gives back exactly what you put into it." Ryan wasn't one to seek out confrontation. His neighbors described him as fair-minded and reasonable, quick to offer help when needed, but equally quick to retreat into his private world when the workday ended. He valued his independence fiercely and expected others to respect the boundaries of his property just as he respected theirs. The beginning of the conflict, that Tuesday morning, began like any other. Ryan rose before sunrise, brewed his coffee, and stepped onto the porch to plan his day while watching the mist rise from the fields. The tranquility was disrupted when he spotted something unusual: a bright yellow SUV parked directly in front of his storage barn. The vehicle, a brand new Lexus with chrome wheels and personalized license plates reading Marg 1, gleamed ostentatiously in the morning light, looking entirely out of place against the rustic backdrop of his farm. "What in the world?" Ryan muttered, setting down his coffee mug with a frown. The SUV was blocking the only entrance to his storage barn where he kept his tractor, tools, and the day's scheduled shipment of organic produce, destined for the Maplewood Farmers Market. His delivery was due by noon, and without access to the barn, he couldn't fulfill his commitments. Ryan approached the vehicle cautiously. Perhaps someone had broken down or needed assistance. But as he circled the luxury SUV, he found it empty, locked, and apparently deliberately parked. There was no note of explanation, no sign of the owner nearby. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing across the property. "Anyone here?" Only silence answered him. Checking his watch, Ryan decided to wait. Maybe someone had made an honest mistake. He busied himself with other tasks, feeding the chickens, checking irrigation lines, and inspecting the tomato plants for signs of blight. Every 15 minutes, he glanced toward the barn, hoping to see the SUV's owner returning with apologies. 1 hour passed, then 2. By mid-morning, Ryan's patience began wearing thin. He had orders to fulfill, deliveries to make, and a schedule that was now completely derailed. He pulled out his phone and called the local sheriff's office, only to be told that since the vehicle wasn't causing a traffic hazard on a public road, they considered it a civil matter. They suggested he leave a note on the windshield. "A note?" Ryan said incredulously after hanging up. "On my own property?" By noon, Ryan's frustration had evolved into simmering anger. The market would be half over before he could make his delivery, if he could make it at all. Regular customers would be disappointed, and he'd lose income he couldn't afford to lose. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting the shadow of the yellow SUV across his barn door, Ryan shook his head in disbelief. Who thinks it's perfectly acceptable to park in the middle of someone else's farm without permission? He wondered aloud, his normally calm demeanor giving way to indignation. This isn't a public parking lot. This is my livelihood. As afternoon shadows lengthened across his fields, Ryan made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer, not with deliveries pending and work piling up. With determination, he locked the farmhouse and climbed into his weathered blue pickup, the engine rumbling to life. The drive into Maplewood gave Ryan time to cool his temper. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation for this intrusion. He'd always prided himself on staying level-headed, even in difficult situations. Main Street bustled with Wednesday activity, locals running errands, tourists browsing shops. Ryan parked outside Henderson's agricultural supply, where he'd been a regular since taking over the farm. The bell jingled as he entered. Tom Henderson, a man with calloused hands and a farmer's tan, looked up from behind the counter. "Ryan! Wasn't expecting you today. Thought Wednesdays were market days," Tom said. "That was the plan," Ryan replied. "But someone decided my farm entrance would make a perfect parking spot." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Yellow SUV? Fancy-looking thing with ridiculous chrome wheels?" Ryan straightened. "You've seen it?" "Not just seen it. Been hearing about those vehicles all week." Tom lowered his voice. "They belong to that new HOA group, Maplewood Estates Preservation Society. Bunch of city folks who bought the old Miller property and built those McMansions. What would they want with my farm? I'm nowhere near their development." Tom shook his head. "It's that woman running the show, Margaret Turner. Moved from Chicago 6 months ago and already thinks she owns the town. Last week, she tried telling the Johnsons they couldn't paint their barn red because it disrupted the aesthetic harmony. The Johnsons' farm isn't even in her jurisdiction." "That's ridiculous," Ryan said, frustration resurfacing. "HOAs don't have authority over neighboring properties." "Tell that to Margaret. Word is, she's eyeing surrounding properties, talking about community standards and unified development. Some folks think she's trying to force sales by making life difficult for holdouts." Ryan's mind raced. His farm wasn't for sale, would never be as long as he had breath in his body. Was this some pressure tactic? "Where might I find this Margaret Turner?" he asked, voice steady despite his simmering anger. "This time of day? Probably at Café Laurent. She holds court there most afternoons. Can't miss her designer everything, talks louder than necessary, treats staff like they're beneath her." Ryan thanked Tom and headed straight for Café Laurent, an upscale coffee shop catering to wealthy transplants. Through the windows, he spotted a group at the corner table. At its center sat a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a cream pantsuit, blonde hair and an elaborate updo, manicured hands, gesturing dramatically. Ryan entered. the scent of expensive coffee hitting him immediately. Conversations hushed as he walked in his work boots and flannel shirt standing out among the clientele. He approached directly, stopping just short of their artfully arranged table. "Excuse me," he said firmly. "Are you Margaret Turner?" The woman looked up, expression shifting from annoyance to amusement as she assessed him. "I am," she replied, voice carrying the polish of old money. "And you are?" "Ryan Wilson. I own Wilson Family Farm on County Road 8. Recognition flickered across her face. "Ah, the farmer. What can I do for you, Mr. Wilson?" "You can explain why your HOA vehicles are parked on my private property, blocking my barn," Ryan said, keeping his voice level, despite the eyes turning toward them. Margaret sipped her coffee before responding. "Oh, that. We're conducting a community survey of properties that might benefit from our oversight. Your farm is within our area of interest." "My farm is private property and not part of any HOA," Ryan stated. "Your vehicles are trespassing and interfering with my business." Margaret waved dismissively. "It's just a farm. Why make such a fuss? Our association is simply exploring expansion opportunities." "I'm not interested in your opportunities," Ryan replied, patience thinning. "I need those vehicles moved immediately." The table fell silent as Margaret set down her cup. Her smile remained, but her eyes hardened. "Mr. Wilson, perhaps you don't understand how things work now. Maplewood is evolving. That quaint little farm of yours is becoming an eyesore in our developing community. We're simply assessing how to better integrate such rustic elements." "My farm has been there for 3 generations," Ryan said, voice dangerously low. "And it's not subject to your assessment. Move your vehicles today." Margaret's laugh was sharp and unpleasant. "Or what? You'll call authorities? I assure you, they understand our position far better than yours." Ryan felt everyone watching. "This isn't a request. It's my property." "It's just dirt and old buildings," she replied, turning back to her companions. "You're a farmer, tend to your crops, and leave planning to those qualified to handle it." The next morning dawned with a perfect blue sky that mocked Ryan's dark mood. He'd barely slept, anger keeping him awake. As he stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, his fears were confirmed. Not one, but 2 gleaming yellow SUVs now sat on his property, one blocking the barn, another in front of his equipment shed. Ryan's hand tightened around his mug. He dialed Margaret's number, which Tom had provided. "Ah, Mr. Wilson," she answered, voice dripping with false pleasantry. "Enjoying the morning? Remove your vehicles from my property immediately," he demanded. "I'm afraid that won't be possible today. Our survey team needs access to evaluate your situation. You're just a farmer. Focus on your little crops and leave big decisions to those who understand progress." The call ended with Margaret's dismissive laugh. Ryan immediately called the sheriff, only to hear, "It's a civil matter. Work it out between yourselves." Ryan stood on his porch, surveying his land that had been in his family for generations. Land he had poured his sweat and tears into, now being invaded by people who saw it as nothing more than a development opportunity. "If they think I'm going to sit back and take this," he muttered, jaw set firmly, "they've made a serious miscalculation." Ryan stared at the 2 yellow SUVs blocking his farm access points, his patience finally snapping like a dry twig. 3 days had passed since his confrontation with Margaret Turner at Café Laurent, and despite his repeated calls to both her and the sheriff's office, the vehicles remained unmoved, a brazen statement of power and intimidation. Each morning, different HOA representatives would arrive in separate cars, conduct their surveys, and leave without moving the SUVs, effectively crippling his ability to operate his farm. "Enough," Ryan muttered, draining the last of his coffee. The cup made a decisive thud as he set it down on the porch railing. "If they won't respect my property, I'll have to make my point more clearly." He walked with determined strides toward the equipment shed, where his old John Deere front-end loader sat waiting. The machine had been his father's pride and joy, a workhorse that had served the Wilson farm faithfully for nearly 2 decades. Ryan climbed into the cab, feeling the familiar worn leather seat beneath him, and turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life, belching a cloud of black smoke before settling into its steady rumble. Ryan maneuvered the loader out of the shed, the morning sun glinting off its faded green paint. He drove slowly past the farmhouse, past the blocked barn entrance where the first yellow SUV sat like an unwelcome sentinel, and continued toward the far end of his property. There, behind the northern field, lay what local farmers euphemistically called organic material storage, a massive pile of composted manure that Ryan had been collecting and aging for months, preparing to spread across his fields for the next growing season. The pile stood nearly 6 feet tall, a dark, earthy mountain that filled the air with its pungent aroma. Ryan positioned the loader at the base of the heap, lowered the bucket, and drove forward. The machine groaned slightly as the bucket filled with a heavy, decomposed waste, a rich mixture of cow manure, rotted hay, and other organic matter that would normally nourish his crops. Today, however, it would serve a different purpose. With the bucket full to capacity, Ryan carefully turned the loader around and drove back toward the first yellow SUV. He could see 2 HOA representatives in pressed khakis and polo shirts standing near the vehicle, clipboards in hand, as they photographed his barn. They noticed him approaching in the large machine and exchanged confused glances. "Excuse me," called one of them, a thin man with carefully styled hair. "What are you doing with that? Equipment?" Ryan didn't respond. Instead, he positioned the loader directly beside the SUV, raised the bucket high above the vehicle's gleaming yellow roof, and with a single, deliberate movement, tilted the bucket forward. The effect was immediate and spectacular. A cascade of dark, odorous compost tumbled down, completely engulfing the SUV's roof, hood, and windshield. The 2 HOA representatives jumped back, shouting in alarm and disgust as splashes of manure spattered their pristine clothing. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" screamed the second representative, a woman whose white shoes were now decidedly not white. Ryan calmly lowered the empty bucket. "Fertilizing my property," he replied, his voice steady. "Which is exactly what I have the right to do on my own land." Before they could respond, he turned the loader around and headed back to the manure pile for a second load. The representatives were already on their phones, presumably calling Margaret, as Ryan filled the bucket again and made his way to the second SUV blocking his equipment shed. This time, there was no one nearby to witness the deluge of compost as it covered the vehicle, burying it under several inches of rich, pungent fertilizer. Ryan took extra care to ensure this load was particularly generous, completely obscuring the yellow paint beneath a thick brown blanket. With both vehicles thoroughly buried, Ryan returned the loader to the equipment shed. He then walked to his workshop, emerging minutes later with a large piece of plywood and a can of black paint. Working quickly, he painted a message in large, clear letters and mounted the sign on a post between the 2 compost-covered SUVs. "Next time, ask permission before parking on my property." Ryan had just finished securing the sign when the distinctive sound of tires on gravel announced new arrivals. 3 cars pulled up at the edge of his property, and out stepped Margaret Turner, flanked by several HOA board members and a man in a suit whom Ryan didn't recognize. Margaret's face contorted with rage as she took in the scene before her $270. Oh, vehicles, buried under mountains of manure, her representatives standing helplessly nearby, and Ryan calmly waiting, arms crossed over his chest. This is destruction of property. Criminal vandalism. I'm calling the sheriff right now, and then my lawyer. Go ahead, Ryan replied, pulling out his phone. While you're at it, let me play you something interesting. He tapped the screen, and Margaret's voice filled the air. It's just a farm, for goodness sake. Why make such a fuss? Our association is simply exploring potential expansion opportunities. Ryan's voice followed. My farm is private property and not part of any HOA. Your vehicles are trespassing. He stopped the recording. I have every minute of our conversation at the cafe, including your admission that you knew these vehicles were on my property without permission. I also have dated photographs showing they've been blocking my access points for 3 days, preventing me from conducting my business. The man in the suit stepped forward, looking concerned. Miss Turner, is this true? Margaret waved dismissively. These tactics are irrelevant. We have authority to— You have no authority here, Ryan interrupted firmly. This is private property that has been in my family for generations. I've filed complaints with the sheriff about your trespassing. When that didn't work, I simply continued my agricultural activities on my own land. If your vehicles happen to be in the way of my fertilizer distribution, that's hardly my concern. The suited man, apparently the HOA's lawyer, pulled Margaret aside, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Ryan could see the man's expression growing increasingly troubled as Margaret gestured angrily. Ryan turned to address the gathered HOA members. This isn't just a lesson for Margaret, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. It's for anyone who thinks they can violate other people's property rights without consequences. My land is not for sale, not for development, and certainly not open to your oversight. Now, I suggest you arrange for towing services with equipment that can handle organic material. As the group erupted into arguments, Ryan turned and walked back toward his farmhouse, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The battle might not be over, but he had definitely won this round. The confrontation at Ryan's farm became the talk of Maplewood within hours. By nightfall, someone had posted a video of the manure-covered SUVs on social media, complete with Ryan's handmade sign prominently displayed. The post went viral overnight, gathering thousands of shares and supportive comments from people across the country who had experienced similar HOA overreach. Local farmer delivers. Organic response to HOA bullying. Read one headline that circulated widely. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict swiftly and decisively in Ryan's favor. 3 days after the incident, the Maplewood Estates HOA called an emergency meeting. The community center was packed with residents, many of whom had never attended an HOA meeting before. Margaret Turner sat rigidly at the head table, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This has been blown completely out of proportion," she insisted, tapping her manicured nails against the wooden table. "We were simply conducting a community assessment when that farmer decided to— That farmer has a name," interrupted Miss S. Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Maplewood for 40 years. "And Ryan Wilson's family has been part of this community longer than any of us. What legal authority did you have to place vehicles on his private property?" Margaret's response was drowned out by a chorus of similar questions. One by one, HOA members stood up to express their dismay at the organization's tactics. Even those who had initially supported Margaret's vision of an upgraded community aesthetic were troubled by the blatant disregard for property rights. "I didn't join this HOA to harass my neighbors," declared Tom Fredericks, a normally quiet accountant who had recently moved to Maplewood Estates. "I move that we request Margaret's immediate resignation." The motion passed with overwhelming support. As Margaret gathered her designer handbag and stalked out of the meeting room, the remaining board members voted unanimously to send Ryan a formal apology and a check for $22. To cover potential vehicle damage and compensate for business disruption. By the following week, news broke that the county commissioner's office had launched an investigation into the HOA's activities, focusing on reports of harassment and exceeding jurisdictional authority. Margaret Turner listed her house for sale and was reportedly moving back to Chicago, her dreams of reshaping Maplewood abandoned in disgrace. On a perfect Saturday afternoon in late summer, Ryan hosted a massive barbecue at his farm. Picnic tables dotted the sprawling front lawn, laden with food brought by neighbors and friends. Children played tag between the apple trees, while adults gathered in groups, many raising their glasses in Ryan's direction. "To standing your ground," toasted Sheriff Davis, who had privately admitted to Ryan that he should have taken the trespassing complaints more seriously. Ryan had kept the sign "Next time, ask permission before parking on my property," mounting it permanently at the entrance to his farm. It had become something of a local landmark, with people occasionally stopping to take photos beside it. "You know, you've become something of a folk hero," commented Emily Chen, the local librarian, as she handed Ryan a plate of her famous apple pie. "People from 3 counties over are talking about the farmer who fought back against HOA tyranny." Ryan smiled modestly. "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just protecting what's mine. And that's exactly why people respect you," Emily replied. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for everyone who's ever felt powerless against organizations that think rules don't apply to them." As the golden sunset cast long shadows across his fields, Ryan looked around at the community gathered on his land that would remain in the Wilson family for generations to come. The battle had been won, not just for his farm, but for all those who valued independence and the right to determine their own destiny. Well, folks, that wraps up our tale of Ryan versus the tyrannical HOA. What did you think about Ryan's creative solution to deal with those trespassing SUVs? Was his manure-based revenge justified, or did he go too far? The court of public opinion seems to have sided with our farmer hero, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had a run-in with an overbearing HOA? Perhaps they fined you for the wrong shade of beige on your mailbox, or objected to your holiday decorations? Share your own HOA horror stories in the comments below. Your experiences might help others dealing with similar situations. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories of everyday heroes standing up against unreasonable authority. Hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss our weekly uploads of real-life drama and satisfying justice. Until next time, remember, sometimes the best fertilizer for justice is a little bit of manure.